I had spent exactly 3,650 days perfecting a routine that I believed was the definition of a meaningful life. For 10 years, my existence was anchored by two pillars: the unwavering support of the parents who had raised me in a cocoon of middle-class safety, and the quiet, almost sacred duty I felt toward Eleanor, the woman who lived in the decaying Victorian house next door. My parents often spoke of Eleanor with a mixture of pity and disdain, calling her a relic of a forgotten time, a crazy old lady whose mind had frayed like the hem of her outdated curtains. They warned me that my kindness was a wasted currency, spent on someone who could offer nothing in return. Yet, every evening after work, I found myself in her kitchen, surrounded by the smell of dust and dried lavender, listening to stories that never quite reached a conclusion. It was a family ritual, as rhythmic as a heartbeat. Every Sunday, I would sit at my parents' polished mahogany table, eating a meal that tasted of security and tradition. My father would talk about the stability of the family legacy, and my mother would smile, her eyes reflecting a warmth I never thought to question. We were a portrait of domestic success. Then, on Monday, I would return to Eleanor's shadows. She was the counterweight to my parents' bright clinical world. She never asked for much, just a few repairs, a heavy box moved from the attic, or simply my presence. 10 years of my life were poured into these two vessels, and I believed they were both filled with the same substance: love. The collapse began not with a scream, but with the hollow sound of a metal latch hitting a wooden floor. When Eleanor passed away, she didn't leave behind a grand estate or a hidden fortune. She left me a single rusted iron box. My parents laughed when they saw it. My father, with his usual air of practical superiority, suggested I toss it into the nearest dumpster before the rust stained my hands. 10 years of kindness for a box of air, Alice, he had said, his voice echoing that cold, rational tone I had always admired. Some people are just black holes. They take until there is nothing left to give. But as I sat in my darkened apartment that night, the box felt heavier than it looked. It didn't feel like air. It felt like a gravity well. I didn't open it immediately. I sat with it for hours, the silence of the room pressing against my eardrums. I thought about my 34 years of certainty. I thought about the names on my birth certificate, the photos in our family albums, and the absolute, unshakable trust I placed in the people who gave me their name. When the lock finally gave way under the pressure of a crowbar, the sound was like a bone snapping. Inside, there were no jewels, there were no deeds to property. There were only letters, dozens of them, tied with a string that had turned brittle with age. And beneath the letters, a stack of official documents dated 1991, the year of my birth. I picked up the first document. It was a birth certificate, but it was not the one I had kept in my safe for a decade. This one listed a different mother, Eleanor Vance, the crazy woman next door. The father was listed as unknown. My heart didn't race. It seemed to stop entirely, as if my body was waiting for my brain to tell it how to react to the impossible. I moved to the next paper. It was a police report from a city 300 miles away, detailing a missing infant, a child snatched from a stroller in a park, while a young mother was distracted for mere seconds. The third document was a bank statement, not Eleanor's, but an offshore account summary. It showed a monthly transfer of $5,000, starting in late 1991 and continuing without interruption for 28 years. The recipients were the people I had called Mom and Dad for my entire life. They hadn't raised a daughter out of love. They had maintained an asset. They were guardians of a secret, paid to keep a stolen child hidden in plain sight, right next door to the woman they had broken. The realization didn't come as a wave. It was a slow, freezing tide. Every Sunday dinner, every birthday present, every "proud of you, honey" was a calculated performance funded by an anonymous source to ensure my silence and Eleanor's isolation. They had watched me spend 10 years of my life caring for my biological mother, and they had laughed at the irony of it behind my back. They had gaslit a grieving woman into believing she was insane while they cashed the checks for her stolen life. I looked at the family photos on my wall, the graduation, the holidays, the forced smiles. They were no longer memories, they were evidence. My reality, which had felt like solid ground seconds ago, had evaporated into a mist of cold, hard numbers and legal jargon. I wasn't a daughter. I was a transaction. And the people who had loved me were the very architects of my ruin. The box hadn't just revealed a secret, it had erased my identity. I sat there until the sun began to bleed through the blinds, the rusted box sitting between my feet like a tombstone for the woman I used to be. My phone buzzed on the table, a text from my mother. "Alice, don't forget we're doing the garden center trip this morning. We need to pick out the new roses. See you at 10, honey." I stared at the word honey until the letters blurred into meaningless shapes. The rose-colored world was gone. In its place was a cold, clinical laboratory where I was the specimen and they were the observers. I didn't reply. I just felt the weight of the letters in my hand, the ink from 1991 staining my fingertips with the truth they thought they had buried forever. The game was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The silence that followed my discovery was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating shroud that seemed to absorb every sound in my apartment. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the debris of my former life, clutching the birth certificate that named Eleanor Vance as my mother. The woman everyone in this town, including the people I called my parents, had spent decades mocking. I remembered the way my mother, or the woman I thought was my mother, would pull her coat tighter whenever we passed Eleanor's house, whispering about unfortunate souls and mental decay. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a 10-year campaign to ensure I never looked too closely at the woman who had brought me into this world. At precisely 10 o'clock, the familiar chime of my doorbell echoed through the hallway. It was a sound that usually signaled the start of our weekend routine, a mundane and safe ritual of gardening and small talk. But today, the sound felt like a warning siren. I didn't move. I watched the shadow of a figure move behind the frosted glass of my front door. I knew it was her. I knew she was standing there with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, holding a coffee she had bought for me as a gesture of maternal love. When I didn't answer, my phone began to vibrate against the hardwood floor. The screen lit up. Mother calling. I stared at the name. It felt like a slur. After a few seconds, the ringing stopped, followed by the sharp, rhythmic rapping of knuckles against the door. The knocking wasn't friendly anymore. It was insistent, demanding. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and moved toward the door. I didn't open it. I simply looked through the peephole. She looked perfect, as always. Not a hair out of place, her silk scarf tied with clinical precision. But as she stood there, waiting, I saw the mask slip for a fraction of a second. Her jaw tightened, and a flash of cold, calculating irritation crossed her face. This wasn't the face of a mother worried about her daughter. This was the face of a landlord realizing a tenant might be late with the rent. "Alice?" Her voice drifted through the wood, muffled but sharp. "I know you're in there. We have a schedule to keep. Don't be difficult." The word difficult sent a shiver of ice through my veins. For 34 years, I had been the opposite of difficult. I had been compliant. I had been the perfect daughter because I believed I owed them my life. I believed their narrative of our happy, chosen family. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the security chain in place. The light from the hallway spilled into my darkened apartment, hitting the edges of the rusted box on the floor behind me. The moment she saw my face, her expression shifted back to the practiced warmth of a doting parent. "There you are, honey. Why is it so dark in here? Are you feeling unwell? You look pale." She reached out as if to touch my face through the gap, but I flinched back. The movement was instinctive, a visceral rejection of the lie she represented. "I found the box, Catherine," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the emotion I expected to feel. I didn't call her Mom. I used the name on her driver's license, the name of a woman I realized I didn't know at all. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. It was as if the temperature in the hallway dropped 20 degrees. Her hand froze in midair. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a gaze so cold and predatory it made my breath hitch. She didn't ask what box. She didn't pretend to be confused. She didn't ask if I was okay. "You were told to dispose of her things, Alice," she said. Her voice had lost all its melodic quality. It was now a dry, rasping whisper, stripped of the facade. "We gave you clear instructions. You have always been so good at following instructions. Why change now?" "Why did you lie about Eleanor?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. "Why did you take the money? Why did you take me?" She didn't flinch. She leaned in closer to the gap in the door, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "We saved you," she hissed. "We took a child who would have grown up in poverty, raised by a woman who couldn't even keep her own mind together, and we gave you a life of luxury. We gave you everything. Do you have any idea how much effort it took to maintain this reality for you? The payments were barely enough to cover the cost of your ingratitude." The sheer arrogance of her words was a physical blow. She wasn't denying the kidnapping. She wasn't denying the hush money. She was framing it as a service she had provided, a debt I now owed her. The woman I had loved for 3 decades was gone, replaced by a stranger who looked at me like a failed investment. "The box stays with me," I said, my voice gaining a hardness I didn't know I possessed. "And I'm going to find out where the money came from. I'm going to find out who really paid you to steal my life." Her reaction was no longer calculated. She lunged at the door, her weight throwing the chain into the frame with a violent crack. "You will do nothing," she screamed, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You are nothing without us, Alice. You are a stolen shadow in a pretty dress. Give me that box, or I swear to God you will regret the day you were born." I slammed the door shut and turned the deadbolt, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. On the other side, the screaming continued for a few seconds. Vile, hateful things that no mother could ever say to a child, before abruptly falling silent. Then, I heard the sound of her heels clicking away down the hallway, fast and purposeful. I leaned my back against the door and slid down to the floor, my eyes fixed on the rusted box. The launch event had occurred. The bridge was burned. I was no longer Alice, the beloved daughter. I was a target. And as I looked at the bank statements again, I realized that Catherine wasn't just afraid of me knowing the truth. She was afraid of whoever was on the other end of those offshore transfers. The parents weren't the top of the food chain. They were just the jailers. And now that the prisoner had the keys, the real owners were going to be very, very angry. I needed to move. I needed to investigate before they found a way to lock the door from the outside. The glowing screen of my laptop was the only light source in the suffocating darkness of the cheap, anonymous motel room I had rented on the edge of the city. The confrontation in my hallway had burned away the last remnants of my panic, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. Fear was a biological response to the unknown, but I was no longer dealing with the unknown. I was dealing with a business arrangement. My parents, Arthur and Catherine, were not emotional creatures driven by twisted love. They were contractors, and contractors always leave a paper trail. I did not need to confront them again. Screaming matches were for people who still believed in moral resolutions. I needed leverage. I needed the data that tethered them to the puppet master who had funded my entire existence. Arthur was an architect by trade, a man utterly obsessed with structure, symmetry, and meticulous documentation. His entire life was cataloged, categorized, and backed up in a redundant cloud storage system that I had personally helped him configure 5 years ago when his technical literacy failed him. He had always praised my efficiency during that project, patting me on the shoulder, calling me his brilliant girl. Sitting in the sterile motel room, the memory of that physical contact made my skin crawl. It was the touch of a warden checking the locks on a cell. I opened the terminal on my computer, my fingers hovering over the keyboard like a surgeon holding a scalpel over a diseased organ. I was about to perform an autopsy on my own life. Bypassing his security was almost insulting in its simplicity. Arthur possessed the arrogance of a man who believed his domestic kingdom was impenetrable. His master password was a variation of my name and the year 1991, the year the crime was committed, celebrated annually with cake and candles as my birthday. It was a staggering display of psychological hubris, locking the secrets of my kidnapping behind the very date they had stolen me. The encryption dissolved without resistance, granting me access to 34 years of categorized deceit. I ignored the folders labeled family vacations and holiday photos. Those were the public relations materials, the carefully curated propaganda of a functional family. I dug deeper, navigating into the archived financial partitions, searching for the anomaly that connected their middle-class architectural salary to the exorbitant offshore transfers I had seen in Eleanor's rusted box. I found it buried within a nested directory disguised as legacy tax documents, a folder simply titled IA v Escrow. When I opened the first spreadsheet, the sheer volume of data momentarily paralyzed the analytical part of my brain. It was a comprehensive month-by-month ledger detailing the financial maintenance of my life. It was not a diary, it was a balance sheet. Every aspect of my childhood had been itemized, monetized, and reimbursed by a Cayman Islands routing number. My pediatric dental bills for braces were listed under asset maintenance. My private school tuition was categorized as value enhancement. Even the Christmas presents they bought me, the bicycles, the dolls, the winter coats, were documented and submitted for reimbursement. I stared at the screen, watching the cursor blink rhythmically, feeling the last invisible strings of my humanity being severed. I was not a daughter. I was a zero-sum equation. Every kiss on the forehead, every moment of supposed parental warmth was a calculated investment to ensure the product remained stable and unaware. But the ledgers were only the skeleton of the conspiracy. The flesh and blood of the betrayal lay in a subfolder containing encrypted PDF correspondence. It took a brute force script 20 minutes to crack the rudimentary password on the documents, and when they finally rendered on my screen, the true architecture of my kidnapping revealed itself in horrifying detail. The emails were directed to a man named Richard Vance, Eleanor's estranged, spectacularly wealthy husband. The correspondence painted a picture of a malice so profound, so meticulously engineered, that it transcended ordinary human cruelty. Richard had not merely wanted to win a custody battle or remove his child from a woman he despised. He wanted absolute biblical vengeance. He wanted to break Eleanor's mind permanently. According to the digitized letters, Richard had orchestrated the abduction from the park, utilizing Arthur and Catherine, a desperate, bankrupt couple facing foreclosure, as his operatives. He bought the house next door to Eleanor through a shell corporation and installed my parents there. He paid them an exorbitant monthly salary with one singular sadistic condition. They had to raise me directly under Eleanor's nose. The strategy was demonic in its perfection. Eleanor spent 10 years living next door to her own biological daughter, offering me cookies, telling me stories, watching me grow up, completely unaware that the child she wept for every night was sitting at her kitchen table. And Arthur and Catherine sat on their porch, sipping wine bought with Richard's hush money, watching the woman next door slowly descend into a grief-induced madness. They watched her mind unravel, playing the role of the concerned, pitying neighbors, all while actively cashing the checks that funded her psychological torture. The cold light of the monitor illuminated the physical truth of my existence. I had spent 10 years pitying Eleanor, believing I was performing an act of charity, when in reality, I was the instrument of her execution. My presence, carefully managed by my captors, was the daily poison Richard fed to his ex-wife, The digital documents did not just prove fraud, they proved a sustained 28-year campaign of psychological mutilation. I closed the cloud server, my mind retreating into a state of absolute, unbreakable calm. The sorrow had burned out, replaced by a mechanized, predatory focus. Arthur and Catherine had built their comfortable lives on the foundation of my stolen identity and Eleanor's destroyed sanity. They believed they were untouchable, shielded by decades of silence and the backing of a billionaire sociopath. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had taught their asset how to navigate the very systems they used to hide their sins. They had given me the tools of their own destruction. I downloaded the entire EV escrow directory, copied it to 3 separate encrypted drives, and wiped the access logs from Arthur's server. I was no longer investigating a crime. I was compiling a targeting package. The drive back to the house I had once called home felt like navigating through a graveyard of my own memories. Every street lamp, every familiar oak tree along the driveway was now a monument to a lie. I wasn't Alice returning for a family dinner. I was a ghost returning to haunt the people who had buried me alive. I pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires with a sound that felt like grinding bone. The house was illuminated, glowing with that warm, inviting light that had once promised security. Now, it looked like a stage set, a fragile facade held together by offshore bank transfers and the silence of a dead woman. I walked through the front door without knocking. The air inside smelled of expensive wax and the slow-cooked roast Catherine had mentioned in her text. It was the scent of a normal life, a scent that now made me feel physically ill. They were in the dining room. Arthur was pouring wine, his movements fluid and relaxed, while Catherine adjusted the silver cutlery with her usual obsessive precision. They looked up as I entered, and for a heartbeat, the practiced masks of parental concern flickered across their faces. "Alice, honey, you're late," Arthur said, his voice a smooth, architectural baritone. "We were starting to worry. Your mother said you were having a moment this morning." I didn't speak. I didn't take off my coat. I walked to the table and placed the 3 encrypted drives and a stack of printed emails directly onto the white linen tablecloth. The physical weight of the evidence seemed to dim the room's artificial warmth. I saw Catherine's eyes dart to the papers. She recognized the letterhead of the escrow account. The blood didn't just drain from her face. It was as if her entire soul retreated behind a wall of cold, hard glass. "It's over," I said. My voice was a monotone, a flat line that cut through the domestic atmosphere like a razor. "I've been inside your cloud server, Arthur. I've seen the EV. Escrow folders. I've read the correspondence with Richard Vance. I know about the monthly payments for asset maintenance. I know I was the weapon you used to kill Eleanor's mind for 28 years. Arthur didn't explode. He didn't deny it. He simply set the wine bottle down with a slow, deliberate click. He sat in his chair, leaning back, his eyes losing every trace of the warmth he had spent 3 decades faking. He looked at me, not as a daughter, but as a structural flaw in a building he had designed. "You were never supposed to find that, Alice," he said, his voice stripped of its paternal mask. It was a cold, businesslike tone. It was a contingency that Richard assured us was impossible. But here we are. You've breached the contract. Do you have any idea what happens to the asset when the contract is breached? "I'm not an asset, Arthur. I'm a human being you kidnapped," I replied, though the words felt hollow in the face of his absolute lack of remorse. Catherine let out a sharp, jagged laugh. She didn't look like a mother anymore. She looked like a predator that had finally been cornered. "A human being? We gave you a life that Eleanor Vance could never have provided. You would have been the daughter of a broken, penniless woman in a rotting house. Instead, you were the daughter of an elite architect. You had the best schools, the best clothes, the best future. We didn't kidnap you, we upgraded you, and we were paid a fair market price for the service." The sheer coldness of her logic was the point of no return. There was no apology coming, no tears of regret. They truly believed that my life was a commodity they had successfully managed. "I've already sent the encrypted files to a secure server with a dead man's switch," I lied, my voice steady. "If anything happens to me, if I disappear, if I have an accident, the police, the media, and Richard Vance's legal rivals get everything. The police report from 1991, the offshore routing numbers, and the emails detailing how you gaslit a mother while her daughter lived 10 feet away." Arthur's eyes narrowed. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear. Not for me, but for his own stability. "You think you're being clever, Alice? You think you can take down a man like Richard Vance? He doesn't just have money, he has the power to erase people. By opening that box, you haven't freed yourself. You've just signed your own death warrant, and ours." "Then we'll all burn together," I said. I picked up a glass of wine from the table and poured it slowly onto the white tablecloth, watching the red liquid soak into the fabric like a blooming wound. "The dinner is over. The family is over. From this moment on, you are nothing to me but defendants." I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't wait for them to plead or threaten further. As I stepped out into the night air, the house behind me felt like it was already collapsing. I had crossed the threshold. There was no way back to Alice. There was only the woman who had survived the lie and the chaos that was about to follow. The silence of the motel room was shattered at 3 a.m. by a notification on my phone. My bank account had been frozen. I stared at the screen, the cold light illuminating the void where my financial security used to be. Arthur and Catherine had wasted no time. This was the first move in their tactical retreat. A scorched earth policy designed to starve me into submission. They didn't just stop the flow of money. They were attempting to erase my ability to exist in the physical world. I watched as my credit cards were declined one by one in my digital wallet, the red declined banners appearing like drops of blood. But they didn't stop at the money. By dawn, the gaslighting had moved into the digital public square. I logged into my social media accounts to find a flurry of notifications. Catherine had posted a long, tearful message about my tragic mental breakdown. She spoke of my obsessive delusions regarding the neighbor, Eleanor, and how the grief of her passing had finally pushed me over the edge. She was preemptively poisoning the well. To the world, any truth I spoke would now be filtered through the lens of a daughter suffering from a psychotic break. She was using the same weapon on me that they had used on Eleanor for 28 years, the crazy label. My inbox began to fill with messages from family, friends, and former colleagues. Some were pitying, others were stern, echoing Catherine's narrative. "Alice, your mother is worried sick. Please check yourself into the clinic she mentioned." "Alice, we know you've been under stress, but these accusations against your parents are hurtful and baseless." I felt the walls of my social reality closing in. They weren't just fighting for their freedom, they were fighting for my erasure. They wanted to lock me in a room, not with bars, but with a diagnosis. The chaos escalated when I tried to access my professional email. My contract with the architectural firm where I worked had been temporarily suspended due to concerns regarding my stability. Arthur had used his influence in the industry to cut my ties there as well. Within 6 hours, I had lost my name, my funds, and my career. I was becoming a ghost, exactly as Arthur had threatened. I sat at the small laminate desk in the motel, watching the storm unfold through the screen. My breathing was slow, deliberate. They expected me to panic. They expected me to call them, crying, begging for the help they were so publicly offering. But they forgot that I was a product of their own environment. They had raised me to be cold, analytical, and resilient. They had taught me that emotions were structural weaknesses. I began to see the patterns in their panic. Catherine's posts were too frequent, too desperate. Arthur's industry moves were too loud. They were afraid that the dead man's switch I had mentioned was real. They were trying to discredit the messenger before the message could be delivered. But the more they pushed the narrative of my insanity, the more they revealed their own hand. In the afternoon, a black sedan pulled into the motel parking lot. I watched from behind the grime-streaked curtains. 2 men in suits stayed in the car, their presence a silent threat. It wasn't the police. It was Richard Vance's cleanup crew. The escalation had reached the top of the food chain. My parents had failed to contain the leak, and now the man who had paid for my kidnapping was taking an interest in the asset. I realized then that the motel was no longer safe. I wasn't just fighting a legal battle or a family dispute. I was a loose end in a billionaire's darkest secret. The gaslighting and the frozen accounts were just the beginning. The chaos was a distraction, a way to keep me pinned down while they moved into position. I grabbed the rusted box, the encrypted drives, and my laptop. I left through the back service exit, slipping into the alleyway as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The world I knew was gone. The people I loved were my enemies. The very air felt heavy with the scent of an impending storm. I was no longer Alice, the architect. I was a fugitive in a life I never asked for, hunted by the people who had claimed to be my protectors. But as I walked into the crowded streets of the city, disappearing into the sea of strangers, I felt a strange, cold sense of freedom. They had taken everything they could give me, the money, the status, the fake love, and in doing so, they had left them with nothing to hold over me. The chaos was their weakness, and my invisibility was my strength. The boardroom of Vance Global was a temple of glass and steel, hovering 50 stories above a city that looked like a circuit board in the late afternoon sun. It was the heart of Richard Vance's empire, a space designed to make everyone within its walls feel small, replaceable, and temporary. I stood at the head of the polished obsidian table, clutching the rusted iron box as if it were a holy relic. Arthur and Catherine sat to my left, their faces pale and drawn, the arrogance they had displayed at the dinner table replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. Across from me sat Richard Vance himself, the man who had bought my life before I was old enough to speak. Richard didn't look like a monster. He looked like an elder statesman, his silver hair and tailored suit projecting an image of absolute, refined authority. But his eyes were like 2 pieces of flint, cold and sparking with a suppressed, lethal rage. He didn't look at the files I had laid out. He looked at me, his gaze scanning my face for any trace of the woman he had destroyed. "You have caused a significant amount of noise, Alice," Richard said, his voice a gravelly, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Noise is expensive. Noise is inefficient. And you have brought this debris into my sanctuary." He gestured toward the rusted box with a flick of his fingers, a movement of pure dismissive contempt. "This debris is the evidence of your soul's bankruptcy, Richard," I replied. My voice was no longer trembling. It was the voice of the architect I was trained to be, precise, structural, and unyielding. "I've spent the last 48 hours ensuring that every piece of data in this box and every byte on Arthur's server is no longer just noise. It is a formal legal complaint, backed by the very bank statements you used to pay your mercenaries." Arthur tried to speak, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "Richard, we tried to contain her. We tried to—" "Silence!" Richard snapped, and Arthur physically recoiled as if he had been struck. Richard turned his attention back to me. "What is it you want? Money? A new life? I can give you a sum that would make these 28 years of maintenance look like pocket change. I can wipe the slate clean. You can walk out of here and never have to look at these 2 failures again." I looked at Arthur and Catherine. They were watching Richard with a pathetic, hungry hope, waiting for him to buy their way out of the disaster they had created. They were still waiting for a transaction to save them. "I don't want your money, Richard. I've lived on your money my entire life, and it tastes like copper and ash," I said. I reached into the box and pulled out the last letter Eleanor had written, a letter she had never been able to send. "I'm here for the truth and fact. I'm here because you didn't just steal a child. You stole the sanity of a woman who loved you simply because you couldn't stand the fact that she was better than you. You used me as a scalpel to lobotomize her spirit." I turned to the wall-to-wall windows and pressed a remote in my hand. On the monitors in the boardroom, the live stream began. I hadn't just brought the files to Richard, I had invited the board of directors, the internal compliance team, and 3 major investigative journalists to a private briefing via an encrypted link. The data was rendering in real time on every screen in the Vance Global Network. The offshore routing numbers, the police reports from 1991, and the cold clinical emails discussing my asset value were being broadcast to the very people who held Richard's empire together. "The reckoning isn't coming, Richard. It's here," I said, watching as the color finally left his face. "Your board is watching this. Your shareholders are watching this. The myth of the visionary philanthropist is dead. You are a kidnapper. You are a torturer. And your contractors are going to prison." The room exploded into a silent chaos of vibrating phones and frantic typing as the board members outside the room began to react. Richard Vance, the man who erased people, was being erased by his own data. Arthur and Catherine realized then that there was no deal coming. There was no payout. They were the first ones the lawyers would sacrifice to save the firm. Catherine began to sob, not out of regret for me, but out of the realization that her life of luxury was over. Arthur just stared at the table. His world of symmetry finally collapsed into a pile of jagged, irreversible ruins. I picked up the rusted box and walked toward the door. I didn't wait for the security guards or the lawyers. They were too busy trying to save themselves from the digital fire I had started. As the elevator descended, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders that had been there for 34 years. The truth hadn't just destroyed Richard Vance. It had dismantled the prison he built for me. I was no longer a stolen shadow. I was finally, for the first time in my life, the architect of my own reality. The city of Seattle was a blur of gray mist and cold rain as I stepped off the train, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the rusted iron box. I had spent 34 years living in a world defined by someone else's blueprints, but as I walked through the terminal, I realized that for the first time, I was invisible in the way I chose to be. The scandal had torn through Vance Global like a forest fire. Richard Vance was currently entangled in a web of federal indictments and civil lawsuits that would likely consume the remainder of his life. Arthur and Catherine had surrendered their assets in a desperate attempt to avoid maximum sentencing, their names now synonymous with one of the most grotesque psychological crimes of the decade. They were no longer my parents. They were merely case studies in the banality of evil. I found a small apartment in a quiet district, far from the polished mahogany tables and the sterile, high-altitude boardrooms. It was a space that required work. The floorboards creaked, the windows let in the scent of the salt air, and the walls were bare. But every inch of it was mine. I spent the first few weeks in a state of profound, meditative silence. I didn't seek out new friends or try to rebuild my career as an architect. Instead, I spent my days at a small desk by the window, looking out at the water, finally allowing myself to grieve for the woman who had lived 10 feet away from me for 10 years. I often think about Eleanor in those quiet moments. I remember the way she looked at me when I brought her groceries, that flicker of recognition in her eyes that everyone else dismissed as madness. She wasn't crazy. She was a mother who refused to let go of the truth, even when the entire world was paid to lie to her. I realized that my 10 years of kindness weren't a waste. They were the only moments of genuine human connection she had in a life defined by isolation. I wasn't just a neighbor. I was the daughter she was never allowed to know. And in some subconscious level, I think we both felt the pull of that invisible thread. I recently started a small hobby, restoring old, discarded furniture I find at local markets. There is something healing about taking something that has been weathered, beaten, and forgotten, and slowly bringing its true form back to the surface. It is a slow, methodical process that requires patience and a willingness to see past the rust and the scars. It is, in many ways, the same process I am performing on myself. My phone no longer buzzes with frantic texts or honey reminders. The digital noise has been replaced by the sound of the wind and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on my wall. Sometimes I look at the family photos I kept, the ones I didn't burn. I look at them not with anger, but with a clinical curiosity. They are artifacts of a museum that has long since closed. I am no longer defined by the theft of my birth. I am defined by the clarity of my survival. One evening, while walking along the pier, I watched a young mother playing with her child in the park. For a moment, my heart tightened, a phantom pain from a life that was stolen. But then I looked at the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting a long golden path across the water. I thought about the zaklichna phrase of Eleanor's last letter, the one she never got to send. The truth is a heavy thing to carry, but it is the only thing that will ever make you light. I am no longer the asset. I am no longer the victim. I am Alice, and for the first time, the name belongs to me. Truth didn't destroy my world. It simply cleared the path to a better one.